Not Quite Right features discussions that are unfiltered and uncensored and may include themes that are inappropriate for younger listeners. Also, I swear a lot.
Something doesn't seem quite right.
Welcome to Not Quite Right. My name's Ed.
And I'm Amanda.
This is the second of 5 Daredevil episodes for the October round of the Not Quite Right prize. So these are people who have volunteered for the privilege of having their stories read out and being roasted on the podcast. But as always, we try to give constructive and useful feedback.
Absolutely.
And so this is the October 2024 round of the Not Quite Right prize. The prompts were
The word palm.
the action of telling a lie.
And the anti-prompt, which was to break the rule, avoid head hopping.
So today's victim is Sarah Kennedy.
Sarah's a latecomer, actually, because we had a DNF amongst the Daredevils this time. There's usually one, actually.
Yep.
And so Sarah came on and filled the spot. So we're excited to have Sarah here and to deep dive into her story.
And her story is called A Non-Consensual Truth.
I think Sarah might be a little bit nervous about this experience, as I'm sure all the Daredevils are, apart from the ones who might be coming back for seconds. And I understand that feeling. It's a bit nerve-wracking to put your art out into the world and then to have people critique it really openly for everyone to hear. But we hope to be not gentle, maybe firm, supportive, and come with some ideas on how to continuously improve and lift your game.
And here is A Non-Consensual Truth by Sarah Kennedy.
Chains dig into my wrists and ankles, but it's bearable. I look at Beth and Charlotte. Like me, they're calm, they're silent, because we need to be. Alison, Charlotte and I join minds like others might hold hands. Words aren't necessary. We're united, by more than words. A single entity. My thoughts are theirs and their thoughts are mine. We're ready for him. He stalks the cell, eyes always on us, flexing his pathetically sized truncheon like an extension of his anatomy. We might be chained, but still he waves it around like a beacon of his deficient masculinity. He passes it from hand to hand, pulls it rhythmically back and forth, across the bars, but its resonating chime is dulled by the dank, crumbling bricks. Enough. We join our minds, think as one, act as one. We are one.
They're pretty weak little things, like 3 wilting flowers. It's no surprise. I'm physically and mentally stronger, and I've been practicing intimidation techniques. It helps my job as a reader. I've been told it's intrusive, the reading, but they brought this on themselves. One of them committed a crime. They all lied about it. They're sinners. They deserve everything they get.
He works on me first, reaching through the bars to place his coarse palms on my temples. He pushes himself into my mind, weaving around with the force that burns. But he finds nothing. Because Alison is disciplined, she lets nothing slip. Then it's my turn. He pierces through every layer of my consciousness to no avail. Beth is strong. Now it's up to me. He thinks he's won through the process of elimination. But I'm equally impenetrable to his fork-tongued mind. The truth remains concealed.
I don't know how these bitches are doing it, but I'll get what I need. I always do. The harder they make it, the more painful for them.
We strike. I open my mind, lock it onto his and slip a gentle thought into his head. I leave him exposed and primed. For me, I mirror Alison's thought and impregnate his brain, dead center. I hand over to Charlotte, and I drive it home, building and building until the lie courses through him, until he's ready to burst, and then realization washes over him in a wave of grey guilt. They'll never suspect that women possess the gift, or that we're more powerful than them. He paces the cell, heel of his hand hitting his head as if he might dislodge the lie from his brain. But it's his lie now, fermenting inside him, solidifying into truth. We believe it, he believes it, and soon when answers are needed, everyone will believe it. It's time for Phase 2. We're in control, We compel him to open the door, hand over the keys, and we release our chains. Now we're free. We can do the rest.
So thank you, Sarah, for your story. And actually, Sarah has left us a voicemail outlining her thought process when she was writing the story. So let's listen to that now.
Hello, my name's Sarah from the UK, and this was my first time taking part in Not Quite Right, but I really enjoyed it, so thank you. So what I wanted to do with this story was to try and make the anti-prompt and all of the prompts really work together to be integral to the story. I think the head hopping was interesting. I found it quite a challenge, but what I tried to do with it was to make sure it wasn't jarring, so to try and get one thought to flow seamlessly onto the other. I'm not sure how well I managed to do that, but that's something I tried and something I had in mind. Since submitting, I've reread my entry and I can see a few places where the sentence structure could be tightened. So any feedback on that would be really helpful. Or any comments, brutal or otherwise, would be good and would be useful. But I think in particular, I'd also like your take on my handling of the anti-prompt and how I might improve my developing of characters and story within a short time frame or word count. So thank you. I look forward to hearing the episode. Goodbye.
Maybe let's start with the anti-prompt, seeing that Sarah has asked for specific feedback on that.
Yeah.
How do you think she went with the anti-prompt?
I think she did exactly what she set out to do. I think it was very clever. It was different. Like, we did have other stories where we were playing with this idea of multiple people's thoughts and moving somehow from one to the other. But I think, she said she tried to make it less jarring by having that thought continue. And I think that worked. And it was interesting and different. And it made sense in the context of the story. So absolutely tick. What you set out to do, you achieved. So well done.
Yeah, and it was definitely one of the ones that went really hard on the anti-prompt. Like, that was the focus of the story, and you can tell that was her inspiration for the story, right? This whole idea of head hopping and three people having their thoughts combine. So yeah, great leaning into that anti-prompt and using that for your inspiration. We love that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just point out too, and we'll get into the detail of the story, but Sarah's chosen character names of Alison, Beth, and Charlotte, right? We're moving from one to the next, and it did not escape my attention that that's A, B, C. Yep. And while that's a little on the nose, I actually liked that. I did feel like that helped me keep track of it, and I understood there's three thoughts here, there's three people, and so it did help to organise that in my mind while I was reading. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah.
Well, if it's good enough for Bridgerton.
What? Do they do that in Bridgerton?
Yeah. The names of the Bridgerton kids are alphabetical. Did you not pick up on that in 3 seasons?
No. Oh, there you go. Okay. I've just learned something. But no, I did think that worked well here. Yeah. And I think it was a helpful sort of little device.
Totally. All right. So should we go through line by line a little bit?
Yeah, and I think we should keep in mind too that Sarah's asking for a bit of feedback, and she did as well. We shared Sarah's question in the long list episode, and it was a similar question around developing character and developing plot within a 500-word, very short story. Yeah. So we'll keep that in mind too as we go through.
Okay, so we open with, chains dig into my wrists and ankles, but it's bearable. So that's the opening line. I look at Beth and Charlotte. Like me, they're calm, they're silent. So what I will say about this opening, and just taking the first line, chains dig into my wrists and ankles, I think that's a great way to set up what's going on.
There's conflict already in that first sentence.
Exactly. But then the second half of that sentence is, but it's bearable, kind of takes the pressure off a little bit.
Yeah, I picked up on that as well. It's like you've set up this super stressful environment, okay, and we see as the story progresses, yes, it's someone who's being held against their will in some sort of like kidnapping situation. So why are we saying that the chains are bearable? Yeah. Like, let's ramp up the stakes. Let's ramp up that drama as much as possible. And remembering too, like, what's the effect you want on the reader there? Do you want the reader to feel stressed about this situation? Like I suggest you do, because you want them to care, in which case absolutely lean on that and push that drama as much as you can.
What I think that these initial lines need a little bit more of is establishing where you are and who you are and what that conflict is. So we know that there's three people here in this room, presumably all chained. I would like to know a little bit more about that situation.
And I think you can use those descriptions to set that up a little bit. So instead of saying, but it's bearable, like, can you describe where you are? You're in chains, but what else? You're in this sort of dungeon environment. And instead of Beth and Charlotte being calm and silent, potentially You want to establish that they're feeling threatened.
Yeah.
And what are they feeling threatened by? While we establish throughout the story that they're strong and that they work together and that they fight this guy mentally, I don't think that's necessarily where we want to start the story. We don't necessarily want to start with, hey, we're already ready to fight him. That's sort of the payoff of the climax of the story. You've got to build towards that. So we want to maybe start with them hoping and wishing that they're going to be able to get out of this situation, and hoping that their skills in terms of communicating as one will help them get there, but maybe not knowing or being confident about that just yet.
I'll also add, I think when we're talking about building characters in 500 words or less, one of the things you do have to leverage, because the word count is so low, is taking like these universal, almost cookie cutter concepts, right? So like someone tied up in a dungeon is something that you can immediately latch onto and say, well, I understand that.
Yeah.
And you need that. We've talked about other stories like I'm in a cafe, I'm in a museum. We can immediately understand where you are. But then you have to take that idea and give it some specificity.
And I think the way you do that is by choosing very specific details. So you were saying earlier you would have liked the setting to be a bit more clear. We do get a few paragraphs down. We get a description here that he's walking back and forth with the baton across the bars, that there's a resonating chime, it's a dank crumbling bricks. Like we've got some descriptions there, which I think probably need to come a bit sooner. Like that's part of that scene setting that needs to happen right up front. But also, okay, dank crumbling bricks, that's still that quite generic idea of someone being captive, which is okay. That's fine. We're getting a sense of where they are. But how can we use very specific details to build either the character or this particular setting, or tell us something about their captor? Is there a calendar on the wall with a picture of a horse on it?
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean about this character now? And that was just a random example. I don't think you should be adding random details. They should be vital details. They should be saying more.
Yeah, they should be painting a picture of, well, what is this specific cell? You know, what differentiates this from any other dungeon, prison, whatever? And like you said, you know, that detail does come, but as readers, we need to be able to picture where we are straight away.
Yeah, so when we're doing critiques and so on, we describe that as dropping into the scene.
Yeah.
And especially in a competition setting, I think it's worth noting we're reading all these very, very different stories. 1 second it's a comedy, the next one is like darkest shit you've ever read, and the next one is like sad, and the next one's a romance, and one's set in the past and one's set in the future in some sci-fi place. You need to, in this competition setting, direct us. Where are we now? As soon as we pick up your story, orient us in your world, orient us as to who's in that world, and almost always that's all going to happen right in the beginning. Who's your point of view character, if that's how we're doing things? And also, where are they? And when are they, when that's relevant, which it often is.
But what you do really well in these first 3 lines is establish the premise of this story, this idea that there are 3 people, their minds are joined like others might hold hands. And so now we understand like the structure of the story and what we're in for.
And I will say that even though this is a really like creative out there concept, I got it. I got it really quickly, and I think that's very difficult to achieve with something so out there. Joining minds like others might hold hands. That line is doing so much heavy lifting, and it's a really, really amazing sort of moment in the story that just helps the reader get it straight away. So that's fabulous.
Yeah, so after those first few lines, we establish that they're in the cell, that there is a captor, and we're ready for him is where that culminates to. And we're now, we move to the next round of these 3 characters and what they have to say. I think as a reader at this point, we want to know, who are these people?
Yeah.
Why are they there? What do they want? We probably assume they want to leave. They're not happy there. But what's put them in this situation? What does he want? Like their captor, what does he want out of this situation? Why is he keeping them there? So he stalks the cell, eyes always on us, flexing his pathetically sized truncheon like an extension of his anatomy. And it's got some comedic elements to it, right? But I find myself like, I just want to understand why they're there in that situation.
Yeah, I will say I think that is probably a big missing component here. And I think it's not ever really spelled out And so Sarah has asked, how do you develop character in these very short stories? And I think one of the things that you need to do, and this is true of novels as well, right? When a character comes on stage in your story, they need to bring the stakes with them. That's one way of looking at it, right? So when you introduce these three women in the beginning, yes, you've set up the premise of the story. You've got that lovely rhythm going. Like, that's all really great. And it's a lot to ask, but you do also need to show us, like, what do they want? And why do they desperately want it, hopefully?
Yeah.
Like, they can't just, oh, that'd be nice if that happened. Like, to make a compelling story, generally you want to make it as vital as possible to the character so that it feels vital to us as readers as well. So in those initial lines, we get a sense that they're captured, and so we can imagine they want to be free. That's kind of our assumption. But free from what and why, and what's the consequence if they're not free? If they don't get what they want by the end of this story, what happens? Do they die? Are they tortured? We don't know. And so therefore, as readers, it's hard for us to care, like, if that happens or not, because we don't know what's going to happen. And same goes for the warden guy, you know, the captor. When he comes on stage, he needs to bring his stakes with him. Why are they there? Why has he captured them? What does he want from them? And what will happen to him if he doesn't get what he wants by the end as well? And he's the villain. We probably don't want him to get what he wants, but we need to understand his motivations.
And so he's introduced actually in the next section. So we get a perspective shift, the first perspective shift into his head. And his thoughts are, they're pretty weak little things like three wilting flowers. It's no surprise. I'm physically and mentally stronger, and I've been practicing intimidation techniques. It helps my job as a reader. And we find out a little bit about why they're there. So one of them committed a crime. They all lied about it. They're sinners. They deserve everything they get. So we get a few things introduced here. We get this idea of a reader. Like, what does that mean? We're not entirely sure. There's some mental battle going on there between them, and we're not entirely sure what the rules of the world are and what these roles are. And the clue that we get, and it's actually the only clue in the whole story about why that they're in there, is that one of them has committed a crime and the others have lied about it. We don't know what that crime is. We don't know if it's a just crime. Like, have they committed the crime of murder? Maybe that they should be in there, you know what I mean?
Did they murder his wife and children?
So I think we need to, again, the specificity. It's great to have the high level view and to leverage the things that we can immediately understand about the story, that they're captive, that someone's committed a crime, but we need to know the next level of detail so that we can really understand these characters.
And I think the implication here is that they've committed some sin against, you know, womanhood, right? Like, they've not stayed in their lane as women. Like, that's sort of what we might imagine has happened. But what does that look like? This might be a Handmaid's Tale sort of situation. You haven't stayed in the kitchen making sandwiches like you're supposed to, and the other two lied about it kind of thing, right? But obviously ramping up the stakes of that. So once we specify exactly what they've done, that also tells us more about him too, because that tells us he judges that as being unforgivable sin and gives us his perspective and that split perspective and that conflict to play with and to think about.
Yeah, there's definitely that whole theme as you've outlined it, that Handmaid's Tale type theme, this whole gendered view. He's looking at them like three wilting flowers, you know, I'm stronger than they are. And they're looking at him as like, well, actually, I'm going to surprise you here. And that's great. But I would really like to see that tied back into, again, why are they there? What is the actual battle that they're fighting? What are they fighting for apart from their freedom? You know, are we on their side? All of those kinds of things need to be spelled out.
So just, I guess, more into the detail of the words here, I would say too that those lines that you've just read, I'm not sure they read as natural thought process for him. So we're in his head now. But it's very sort of expositional. It's very much like, you've got to tell us now as readers like what's going on here. And look, there's definitely room for that in flash fiction. You don't want to obscure everything because your readers will be confused. But if you're going to present something as his internal thoughts, I feel like it's got to feel more like a person's natural thoughts. So the line, "and I've been practicing intimidation techniques." I can't imagine a man thinking that. What would he be thinking? He could be remembering one of those techniques. Like, what's he done to someone else? How has he stood over and threatened someone else? Or he could be worried about how his techniques are going to play out, or he could be feeling really overconfident. It applies to dialogue and to internal thoughts in much the same way. It's got to feel natural and it's got to feel like it's coming from that character. So when you ask Sarah about how do I develop character, you've given us insight right into his head. That's your opportunity. How are you going to describe it in such a way that tells us how this guy thinks? And I think you could do that. I think you could work on those sentences there and use them to reveal more about the kind of guy that he is and what he's been doing to practice, rather than sort of stating it outright like that.
I think a lot of this comes back to showing, not telling. And this is a very internal and interior story. Like we are in the women's thoughts, then we're in the man's thoughts. And if you imagine this playing out as a scene in your head, a lot of the action is actually just thoughts. Right. So we see the action of him walking down the cell and rattling the bars of the cell with his little truncheon. But beyond that, we don't see too much else actually happening in terms of action. It's very internal. So I would say that's one of the things in this story that I would call out as something to work on, is making that internal action be an external action, actually be things happening in the scene. So think about how you can transform those thoughts that he's having. I'm physically stronger than them. I've been practicing intimidation techniques. Well, show us his strength in the scene. Show us his intimidation tactics as he speaks to them, you know, as he interacts with those, with the women.
Clangs the truncheon on the bars, the way he speaks to them, like maybe he's spitting and it's in their faces, or maybe he's like the way he's stomping around the room. What does that reveal too? He might be putting on this bravado of, I'm going to bang this thing and I'm going to make a lot of noise, but is he sweating as well? Like, is he twitching? Like, does he always keep reaching into his pocket looking for something like a comfort? How are his actions sort of betraying him as well? Yeah. And you can say a lot through someone's actions as well, like this whole idea of them being sinners and have committed some crime, even in this Handmaid's Tale type world, which we're assuming that this is kind of set in. But, you know, you can express that through his actions, the fact that he believes that they're sinners, that they've done something unforgivable. Have him come out and show that. Yeah, like what's he wearing? What are they wearing? I'm not saying you want all these details. We've only got 500 words, but these are all options. Yeah. These are all things that you can use to say more about the characters. How do these things contrast against each other? For example, if we're going to choose what are they wearing, how does his outfit contrast against what they're wearing? What do their clothes reveal about how women are treated in this society versus how men are treated in this society? Like, these are ways that you can reveal a little bit more of that world that we're investing in as well.
Okay, so then we move to the next little passage where he works on me first, reaching through the bars to place his coarse palms on my temple, and he pushes himself into my mind. So we are introduced now to this fact that he's searching for something. There's this mind connection that's happening, and he's been practicing these techniques and he's trying to extract information. We're not clear really on what that information is. It's assumed, I guess, that it's related to the crime. But again, the specificity is important there because we're on unstable ground with all of these characters really in terms of what they actually want from the situation.
But also he seems quite confident that one committed the crime and two lied about it. So why does he even need information? He seems to have the information that he wants. They're already captive. It's not like he needs to convince a court. So we need to think about what is he searching for and what will he get if he gets that out of them? What will they lose if he gets that out of them? And that needs to be very, very clear on the page. I would just maybe question that too. So he describes himself as a reader, right, which we take to be a mind reader. And I really like that idea of him pushing himself into them. Like, obviously there's some implications there which I think fit the theme of this story very well. But we've got now he's the reader, but also they're the mind readers too. Yeah. And I'm not clear on what that all means. He seems to have some special role in this society, but they also possess this power. How do people possess this power? Is it a job that he's just learned how to do? Is this something everyone in this world can do? I feel like maybe only one side of this battle needs to be the mind reading side. I don't know what you think about that, but it feels like they're just sort of on equal footing. If he's this threat to them because he's going to read their minds, I feel like they shouldn't read his mind back. It's great that they can protect their minds by holding hands, mentally.
Yeah.
It's great that they're protecting themselves against this reader, but they flip that back on him and then they're reading his mind and not actually reading, but implanting a lie in his mind. And I just feel like that's a bit confused then. I'm not sure,
There is a moment of explanation. They say they'll never suspect that women possess the gift or that we're more powerful than them. So there's, this idea of a gift that some people have of mind reading that presumably he has, but women generally don't have or assume not to have, yet we have 3 women who all seem to have the gift. So, yeah, it needs a little bit more explanation. The next section where we go through more of this mental battle that's taking place.
Yeah.
I found it very difficult to picture actually what was happening. And this is, I guess it's part and parcel to what you're describing here. It's a mental battle that is fought between people and trying to get in each other's minds and change what people are thinking. They're trying to implant this lie, right? And how do you describe that? And there are phrases like, I open my mind, lock it onto his and slip a gentle thought into his head. I leave him exposed and primed. For me, I mirror Alison's thought and impregnate his brain dead center. So we've got this fight. It's really internal. And if I try to picture this scene in my head, I see 4 people kind of sitting there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do.
So maybe there is, and you see this in movies where there's mental battles, like think in Inception, like for one, right?
We were just watching that the other night. I was totally thinking of Inception because, of course, they're trying to implant ideas in that movie.
Yeah, and that's an action movie.
Yeah.
It's the opposite. And so I think the challenge here is finding a way to make that battle manifest in reality. You can imagine a Harry Potter type way with magic kind of flying through the air or something like that manifests that physically.
Yeah, or even just, it doesn't have to go in that way. It can be more like he's almost acting like he's got a headache. Sarah does describe he's basically thumping himself on the head, trying to dislodge the light. We need more of that, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. And using that space, using that setting, is he flinging back against the bars? What are they doing? Are they just calmly lying there with their chains around them, or are they pushing forward, like really straining to achieve this? Those things have very different feelings to them. And so it's a matter of choosing how you want this to feel.
Yeah, and so now we are at the point where they've overcome him. They've implanted this lie. And the lie is placed as the groundwork to take it to phase 2, but we need to know exactly what is that lie that is convincing him to now presumably help them, even though he's trying to fight against it.
I get embarrassed because I just feel a bit dumb sometimes and I'm like, I just don't get it. And I try and reread and I couldn't understand this part. So the part where they're saying they're driving home that lie, it's building and building until it courses through him and is ready to burst, and then realization washes over him in a wave of grey guilt. Realization of what? I have no idea. And then when it comes to the next line, it's like them all having this same thought. They'll never suspect that women possess the gift or that we're more powerful than them. Is that part of the lie? It doesn't seem like the lie because it seems very much like they possess the gift and that they're more powerful than him. Yeah. But it's linked to this idea of the lie. And so I'm lost there, I'll be honest. And yeah, it makes me feel dumb. And if it was explained to me by Sarah, I'm sure I would be like, oh, okay, yeah, great. But storytelling is a form of communication. And every time you don't take the reader with you, take one of the judges, of this competition with you, you run the risk of that just completely whooshing over our heads and us not appreciating the depth of what you're trying to achieve. And I get the sense that in your head there was a lot going on here and more under the surface, and that it all makes sense in what you're writing here. I'm getting touches of that, and I absolutely am getting that undercurrent. But there's just some dots that aren't connecting for me. And I feel like you as the author need to connect some of those dots. Maybe not all, but at least enough for me to feel like, okay, I understand why this is happening and what's happening.
And I've got to say, I think this is a great idea for an ending. I think this is the kind of ending that you want for this story. But again, it comes back to, have you built up that detail and that understanding of the characters where this ending flows naturally? Because how I imagine this ending playing out is, again, we're in this world, we have this view of gendered politics and men versus women, and women aren't seen as important or powerful. And these women prove him wrong. And they prove him wrong by implanting this thought in his head that maybe the world is different to how he thought it was. And he sees that as a lie, right, in his head. Like, that's a lie, and he fights against it. But then that lie becomes the truth, and he realizes, oh, actually, that's true, and he feels guilty about it. And that's when he's like, well, actually, I've been wrong my whole life. I'm going to help these women. And that's how, he turns it around. And then we have like a story arc there. We have a character who changes from being this evil woman hater to someone who's sympathetic. But we need to understand, his mental state and their mental state and what the fight is all about. That needs to really be concrete so that we can follow it.
Yeah, and I think it's all summed up, I guess, in this final line. It's time for phase 2. We're in control. We compel him to open the door, hand over the keys, and we release our chains. Now we're free. We can do the rest. Like, the rest of what? And that is my question. Phase 2 of what?
Yeah.
And they're released into what? Are they just going back into this world that treats them like crap? What does being free look like? If they were able to be captured by this guy and held against their will because of some crime that presumably they've all lied together, like presumably they think it was justifiable, they're going back into that world.
Yeah.
So I think it's just too many questions, basically. I think maybe simplifying some of that down would help, and just keeping it to one sort of key thing. Practically speaking, again, we come back to what Sarah asked at the very beginning, which was, how do I develop plot and character in so few words? And in this story, one of your challenges that you've set for yourself is that you've given us 4 characters. And that's a lot.
Yeah.
For a 500-word story. We would usually advise like 2, maybe 3, where a third character is like a third wheel kind of situation and creating conflict. 4 characters, 3 of whom are sort of very similar. While I appreciate the idea you've got going on, so I'm not saying necessarily don't have them, like in this story they're needed, it's part of the idea, but normally what I would say is make them all one character.
Yeah.
Because they're all achieving the same thing, they're all, from a conflict perspective, they hold the same ground, and then if you only had one of them, you would be able to go a little bit deeper into what she specifically has done and what her motivations are and her potentially a little bit of backstory and all that sort of stuff. Now, that doesn't work in this particular story because you're trying to do something a little bit different, but that is the challenge I think that you've set for yourself. And normally I would say reduce your cast of characters. That's your first step in character development because it gives you more words to play with. And secondly, I would say if you are going to have a slightly larger cast of characters, go to Emily Rinkovar's story from the shortlist, right? We were talking about how she developed this whole rich character in just a sentence or not even a whole sentence for multiple different characters in that story. And look, I can't even do it myself. I would just say, look at how she did it.
I think one of the things she did was choose like one great detail that really exposes a character. There was a classroom setting that we can all understand, right? That's the general that we can all immediately place ourselves in the classroom. But then the specific is those details that you choose about the character, what they write on the blackboard that shows us what kind of people they are.
Yeah.
It's all about choosing those specific details.
Yeah,
to
choosing
focus in
very carefully, like what are you showing? And we really have no detail about these 3 women or this captor. It's all very sort of floating there. We don't know what they look like. We don't have any context around how they got to where they are or who they are. Like, we don't even know their age or anything beyond just their names. And names are important, like that tells us something, and we have gleaned from it, what the central conflict is, this man versus women sort of conflict that's going on, but we don't know what that means for them personally. And that's when story really hits home, when it gets personal. And then, so that's character, but then in plot terms, like how do you handle plot in 500 words? I think what you've got here is a good amount. I think maybe it's just about choosing where to trim and where to expand. And I think there are some opportunities to trim. Like, we've got that lovely rhythm going with the 3 women and their thoughts and sort of fighting him, but maybe engineering that to reveal a little bit more about the reasons behind the conflict, reveal a little bit more about their character, his character at the same time. Like, not just sort of going through the motions of we're binding together and battling him, but like, who's binding together and what does that mean and why are you here? And I think if you can weave character into plot as much as possible using those details, then those 2 things will be working in harmony together and it's not like 2 jobs, it becomes just one job. What I really want to do is applaud Sarah on her very bold take on the anti-prompt, it did strike me immediately like this was something different. As soon as you pick it up, you're like, yeah, this is cool. We talked about in the long list episode that element of surprise. This story had that element of surprise. And so I think all it needed to then deliver was some of those answers to the questions we've talked about, like why are they there? Who are they exactly? And with all that together, I think this could have been really a standout piece.
Yeah, for sure. And not only the anti-prompt, also the action prompt as well. The light leans in very heavily into those two prompts.
And coming in hot with a first attempt of Not Quite Right prize and really embracing that anti-prompt. So doing all the other newcomers proud, I think.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
You haven't been scared off by that. I know it was very intimidating to a lot of entrants this round. Like, this was a tough one.
Yeah,
and
it really was.
But you've just made it your bitch, basically. Is that totally inappropriate to say in the context? I just want to mention something as well that Sarah put in her general feedback when she entered the comp. She said, there isn't time to ponder over ideas, questioning them and convincing yourself they won't work. They just have to work, so you make them work. And I think that is the beauty of these competitions where you get an idea and it's like, you know what, run with it and see what happens. And sometimes you produce gems out of that. And I think that's a really thrilling feeling, like when you're just confident and you run with an idea and you see where it takes you. And I can see that that's what's happened here. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I feel like that's the only way to do it, really, because
Totally.
you just can't. The moment you get an idea that you're like half compelled to write, that's the idea.
Yeah.
You cannot wait around for like the perfect idea that's fully formed and fleshed out. No, you've just got to choose something that appeals to you and see where it goes.
And I know all writers approach things differently, and I would describe myself normally as quite a plotter, but when it comes to flash fiction, no, not at all. You sort of can't. And I think for those who are newcomers, the best advice I could give you is just to write it sometimes and see where the story starts to take you, because it can take you on these really interesting paths and it sort of starts to develop its own voice. And when you really take an idea and run with it, that's when you start to discover, I suppose. They do call it discovery writing. There's another way of describing pantsing. But I can see that that's what Sarah's done here too. She's like, you know what? I've got this idea. I'm going to explore it and see what happens.
So thanks again, Sarah, for sharing your story with us. And we know that it's tough to put it out there, especially when it's being read on a podcast and talked about. That's a very intimidating thing, but you've done very well and we enjoyed your story.
Yeah, and I hope you enjoyed your fizzy wine while you were listening to this feedback, and I hope it didn't hurt too much. We have your best interests at heart and we hope it was useful, and we really hope you come back again, because we love your style. We love how brave and bold you are with your writing, and we'd love to see more of it.
Absolutely. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode, and we'll be back next week with another Daredevil. And until then, ride on.
Right on.
We hope you enjoyed this special Daredevil episode of Not Quite Right. If you have thoughts on this story, follow us on social media and join the conversation. And if you'd like to participate in the next round of the competition, head over to our website at notquiteright.com. That's WRITE.
Something doesn't seem